This video is sponsored by Reblum. Now, it's really no secret that Nikon has had a slightly tough time in the mirrorless camera market. Despite being one of the major players in the DSLR and SLR world for many decades, the company's entry into the mirrorless camera market suffered a somewhat rocky start. Its original line of tiny mirrorless cameras, known as the Nikon 1 series, was discontinued after just 7 years, mainly due to the number of sales failing to meet expectations. So Nikon switched focus and started producing a new range of mirrorless cameras with larger APS-C and full-frame sensors in order to compete with its biggest rivals at the time, Sony, Canon and Fujifilm. And this saw the birth of this current Z line of cameras, or the Z line if you're from America. But even this relatively new range of cameras has suffered a lot of criticism over the years, with earlier models in particular being compared to root vegetables in terms of appearance. But despite this negativity, Nikon seemed to be absolutely smashing it out the park with the last few full-frame releases, most notably the ZF and the Z8, which have both somewhat silenced the critics. And it looks like Nikon is on track for making it 3 out of 3 with this most recent release, the Nikon Z6 Mark III, which was announced just over a month ago. Now, personally, I think this has all the potential to be the company's biggest success yet, and I'll explain why throughout the course of this video. Now, although I wasn't lucky enough to be at the official launch event in London, Nikon did reach out to me slightly afterwards and ask me if I'd be interested in borrowing a loan copy of this camera for a few weeks just to see what I thought. And after a couple of weeks of shooting with it, I certainly have some thoughts on it. Now, just for some context, I have bought and shot with a whole bunch of different brands over the years, starting with Canon DSLRs right at the start of my photography journey, and then moving over to Sony when I started shooting more video. But these days I own and shoot with a whole range of cameras for various different reasons, but the main brands I shoot with on a weekly basis are Sony, Fujifilm and Panasonic. So I'm certainly not loyal to any particular brand, and of all of the camera makes, I've certainly shot with Nikon the least, so consider this a review from the perspective of a Nikon outsider. Anyway, in terms of handling, this camera honestly offers just about everything you could ever hope for on a camera. There are plenty of manual buttons and dials, including 2 command dials on the top here. There's a joystick on the back that allows you to quickly move around the AF point, though you can also use the D-pad for this, or even the touchscreen, so it honestly caters to just about any kind of shooting preference. Now, you don't often see top plate displays anymore, and honestly this threw me back to my days of using DSLRs, but in many ways I really do appreciate it having this here, as it makes it nice and easy to quickly check your shooting settings at a glance. The hand grip on this is very nice, it's super deep and the rubberized texture gives it plenty of grip, and the vast majority of controls are all reachable with just your right hand alone, including these sneaky little function buttons near the lens mount here for even more access to shortcuts. Now, if I was being super critical, I would say that I do miss not having a dedicated exposure compensation dial like the one that they added onto the Nikon ZF, which I tested on this channel just a little while ago. However, I gotta admit I do admire how methodical Nikon are with their button placement, because just behind the shutter button here you'll notice that there are 2 buttons, one for ISO and one for exposure comp. Now, if you hold down either of these buttons with your index finger, you can then use your thumb to move the rear thumb dial to alter these settings very easily, which I think is a really efficient way of working. But I've got to admit, the most outstanding addition to this camera has to be the EVF. This thing is so crisp and bright. It's easily one of the nicest EVFs I have ever used. Its super high resolution 5760K dot display means that you can quite reliably use it to check the critical focus of your images by zooming into them whilst using the EVF, which is super useful when shooting in sunny conditions. Now, right next to this you'll notice a small switch that allows you to quickly toggle between photo and video capture, but we'll talk more about the video side of things a little bit later on in this video, because in particular this is an area where the camera really shines. But first I want to talk about what's on the inside of this camera, because behind the lens there's a pretty unique sensor type. This is a newly developed 24 megapixel partially stacked sensor, which, without getting too technical, basically means that the sensor is able to offer faster readout speeds than a traditional sensor design. But it isn't quite as expensive to manufacture as a fully stacked sensor like the one used on the more premium Z8 and Z9 models. Now, having faster readout speeds is obviously going to be great for video capture, but it also gives this camera the edge over its competitors when it comes to stills photography too, as it means that it can can reduce the appearance of that jello-like rolling shutter effect when using the electronic shutter, which is certainly something that most photographers know and hate. Comparing this against my Sony A7 Mark IV, the results are certainly better, but far from being perfect. So I definitely wouldn't make this a defining reason to buy this camera. But before I get too carried away, I first wanted to see what this chip could do in a real-life scenario. So I started off by taking a few portraits of my friend Mia, and as this is the UK summertime, it's only fitting that it was pissing it down with rain. But on the plus side, at least it gave me a chance to test out the Z6 weather seal construction, which held up very well, I must add. And as you can see from these unedited RAW files, the photos look pretty damn good straight out of the camera, with nice natural colours and lovely crisp detail. And this is in part thanks to this 85mm f1.8 lens that Nikon also let me borrow alongside this camera. However, high quality images are sometimes a blessing and a curse, for portraits at least, because this means that blemishes and other skin imperfections are much more clearly visible, unless you get some help from today's sponsor, Reblum. Now, Reblum is a portrait retouching app that aims to save you time by removing things like blemishes, dark circles, and other skin imperfections whilst maintaining natural skin textures for professional looking results. And all of this can be done in just mere seconds using either the standalone app or via the Photoshop, Lightroom, and Capture One plugins. So no internet connection is required, and there's no risk of your private photos being leaked from the cloud. Your photos stay on your computer. To retouch these photos, once I've color graded them in Lightroom, I simply select them all and then go up to Photo, Edit in, Reblum, and then Reblum can work its magic. There are currently two styles to choose from, natural or fashion, and the results can be fine-tuned using these two simple sliders down here, which means this is an extremely easy piece of software to use. Once you're happy, you can simply export your photos and you're done. It really is just that simple. And as you can see, the results look nice and natural. There are both subscription and lifetime license options available, and there are no limits or cost linked to the amount of photos you can process, meaning that you can potentially edit hundreds of photos without having to worry about spiraling costs. You can download Reblum today for a free trial using the link in the video description below, and thanks once again to Reblum for helping to support this channel by sponsoring this video. Anyway, another benefit of having this partially stacked sensor is that Nikon claims the autofocus speed is now 20% faster than the previous Z6 Mark II. Now, I've only had a limited amount of time with the Z6 Mark II myself in the past, so I'm not going to sit here and make any direct comparisons, but I can at least confirm that while shooting with the AF on this camera, it did appear to be very fast and accurate, albeit not entirely faultless, as there were a number of examples that I took where it did decide to lock onto Mia's nose or the tips of our eyelashes rather than her pupils. But even so, the hit rate was certainly high enough to come away with some nice looking results. Now, as is quickly becoming the norm for most modern cameras these days, this Z6 Mark III can identify and track things like faces, animals, cars, trains, etc. Though the thing I see most people raving about online is the 3D tracking mode, which has been taken directly from the Z8 and essentially allows the camera to lock on and follow moving targets, even if they pass in front of obstacles and other objects, which I can confirm works just as well as everyone is making out. Now, because the readout speeds aren't quite as fast as those on the Z8 with its fully stacked sensor, Nikon has opted to keep the mechanical shutter in this camera, and using this you can rattle off images up to 14 frames per second in RAW, JPEG, or RAW and JPEG without a crop, which is very impressive. Now, at this point I should mention that this camera has two card slots, one for CF Express Type B cards and also a standard UHS-2 SD card slot. Now, personally, I kind of wish they made the CF Express card slot one of those hybrid ones that you can either accept CF Express or regular SD cards, like what is available on the Sony A7 Mark IV, as I know a lot of people haven't made the jump over to CF Express cards just yet, mainly because they are still quite expensive. And if you're someone who likes to shoot photos onto two cards as a bit of a backup safety feature, this may force your hand into having to invest into some CF Express cards. Now, obviously, the benefit of using CF Express cards is that the write speeds are a lot quicker than SD cards, and so you can rattle off more shots for longer without having to worry about filling up the buffer, which will certainly help when switching over to the electronic shutter, because this will allow you to increase this burst shooting mode up to 20 frames per second, again in RAW, JPEG, or RAW and JPEG without a crop. Though impressively, this camera still has a few extra gears past that, offering speeds up to 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second in JPEG only, but without a crop. And then it can go one stage further to a staggering 120 frames per second, albeit this will be JPEG only and with the DX crop mode activated. But nonetheless, paired with the faster autofocus and readout speeds, this potentially makes this a very versatile camera that is capable of capturing even the most demanding types of photography. Now, one thing that has been a point of discussion online is supposedly this new chip design provides less dynamic range than a traditional non-stacked sensor design. Now, I'm not going to sit here and dive deeply into the technical analysis of this because there are others who are way more knowledgeable on the subject than I am and have done a much better job of explaining it, so feel free to do your own research on that if you want to. However, my basic understanding of this, and please do correct me if I'm wrong in the comments below, this seems to be an issue with most stacked sensor designs anyway, as they don't apply noise reduction to the raw files, and therefore if you boost a severely underexposed shot taken with this, you'll get a crap ton of noise and an apparent reduction in image quality and a loss of detail. However, in my opinion, unless you're somebody who really needs to push and pull your raw files dramatically in order to get the result you want, this really isn't likely to be something that will cause you issues on a daily basis. I mean, during my time with this camera, I've literally never had to do anything like that because I'm mainly shooting in bright daylight, which I imagine most of you guys will be doing too, right? The bottom line is that the images this creates just look great, but then honestly, name me a modern camera in this price range that doesn't. The colors it captures look nice and natural straight out of the camera, and the camera in general is just practically faultless in its operation, so there's really zero complaints from me. But we've not even got to the good bit, because arguably where this camera really excels compared to its rivals Sony, Canon and Panasonic is with video capture, because this camera is able to record 6K 12-bit RAW internally. Though just to clarify, this 6K footage isn't going to be open gate footage like that offered by the Panasonic S5 Mark II, the S9 or the recent GH7. This is very much standard 16:9 footage. There are also two flavors of RAW capture to choose from, including NRAW and ProRes RAW, with both options offering a maximum frame rate of up to 60 frames per second with no crop. Hey, Future Tom here. So this is the part of the video where I'd normally show you some of that 6K RAW footage. However, unfortunately, even after losing multiple hours of my life trying to process it, I ran into a weird problem where when I imported the footage into Premiere, it would completely mess with the colors and make it look like, well, this. So needless to say, this is not an accurate representation of what it can actually do, and unfortunately I have run out of time to try and find a workaround. I'm assuming it's something to do with the codecs, but if you have any suggestions, please let me know in the comments below. So sorry I can't show you the full extent of what this camera is capable of, but I will add some links to other YouTubers who are far more competent than I am and able to provide some better examples. Anyway, back to the video. Now obviously shooting in RAW is not only going to require plenty of memory card space, but also hard drive space afterwards, and adequate processing power on your computer to edit as well. So in most cases, I will imagine that people will deem this a little bit overkill, but luckily it also offers 4K 10-bit video recording up to 60 frames per second without a crop, or 4K 8-bit recording up to 120 frames per second with a DX crop. Now alongside this, there's also 8 stops of IBIS, which I believe is the same design used on the Nikon ZF, and it does a pretty good job of eliminating shake in your video footage while shooting handheld. So needless to say, this is an incredibly competent hybrid camera, which in many ways outspecs its closest rivals such as the Sony A7 Mark IV, Canon R6 Mark II and Panasonic S5 Mark II. Though you do have to bear in mind that those alternatives that I just listed are also a few years older, with the Sony A7 Mark IV in particular expected to receive an update in the next year or so. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see how the other brands aim to compete with what this Z6 offers. But whichever way you slice it, this Z6 Mark III is truly an impressive camera, and one that has managed to raise the bar in this category, placing Nikon once again at the forefront of the camera world.